Hello Shack fans. Facebook wouldn't let me post an event notification for today for some reason, so here I am. I hope if you've been listening before that you will that you'll catch up later with it. So chapter 5 of The Shack by William Paul Young. Gosh, that was quick. 2 people already. Chapter 5. There are times when you choose to believe something that would normally be considered absolutely irrational. It doesn't mean that it is actually irrational, but it surely is not rational. Perhaps there is a supra-rationality, reason beyond the normal definitions of fact or data-based logic, something that only makes sense if you can see a bigger picture of reality. Maybe that is where faith fits in. Mac wasn't sure about a lot of things, but at some time in his heart and mind during the days following his tiff with the icy driveway, he became convinced that there were 3 plausible explanations for the note. It was either from God, as absurd as that sounded, a cruel joke, or something more sinister from Missy's killer. Regardless, the note dominated his thoughts every waking minute and his dreams at night. Secretly, he began to make plans to travel to the Shack the following weekend. At first, he told no one, not even Nan. He had no reasonable defence in any exchange that would result after such a disclosure, and he was afraid that he might get locked up and the key thrown away. Anyway, he rationalised such a conversation would only bring more pain, with no resolution. "I'm keeping it to myself for Nan's sake," he told himself. Besides, acknowledging the note would mean admitting that he had kept secrets from her. Secrets he still justified in his own mind. Sometimes honesty can be incredibly messy. Convinced of the rightness of his impending journey, Mac began to consider ways to get the family away from home for the weekend, without rousing any suspicions. There was the slim possibility that the killer was trying to lure him out of town, leaving the family unprotected, and that was not acceptable. But he was stumped. Nan was too perceptive for him to show his hand in any way, and doing so would just lead to questions that he was not ready to answer. Fortunately for Mac, it was Nan herself who proffered a solution. She had been toying with the idea of visiting her sister and family up in the San Juan Islands, off the coast of Washington. Her brother-in-law was a child psychologist, and Nan thought that getting his insights on Kate's increasingly antisocial behaviour might be very helpful, especially since neither she nor Mac were having any success getting through to her. When she brought up the possibility of the trip, Mac was almost too eager in his response. "Of course you're going," was his reaction when Nan told him. That was not the reply she had anticipated, and she gave him a quizzical look. "I mean," he floundered, "I think that's a great idea. I will miss you all, of course, but I think I can survive alone for a couple of days, and I have lots to do anyway." She shrugged it off, perhaps grateful that the path for her to leave had opened so easily. "I just think it would be good for Kate, especially, to get away for a few days," she added, and he nodded in agreement. A quick call to Nan's sister and their trip was set. The house soon became a whirlwind of activity. Josh and Kate were both delighted. This would extend their spring break for a week. They loved visiting their cousins and were an easy sell on the whole idea, not that they really had any choice in the matter. On the sly, Mac called up Willie and, while trying rather unsuccessfully to not divulge too much information, asked if he could borrow his friend's 4-wheel drive Jeep. Since Nan was taking the van, he needed something better than his own little car to negotiate the pitted roads in the reserve, which would most likely still be buried in winter's grip. Mac's odd request predictably started a barrage of questions from Willie, questions that Mac tried to answer as evasively as he could. When Willie bluntly asked if Mac's intention was a trip to the Shack, Mac told him that while he could not answer his questions at that moment, he would explain fully when Willie came over in the morning to exchange vehicles. Late Thursday afternoon, Mac saw Nan, Kate and Josh off with hugs and kisses all around, and then he slowly began his own preparations for the long drive to northeastern Oregon, to the place of his nightmares. He reasoned that He wouldn't need much if God had sent the invitation. But just in case, he loaded up a cool bag with much more than enough for the miles he would be travelling, and then added a sleeping bag, some candles, matches, and a number of other survival items. Lost my place. There was no doubt the possibility that he had turned into a complete idiot, or was the butt of some ugly prank, but he would then be free to just drive away. A knock at the door startled Mac from his concentration, and he could see that it was Willie. Their conversation must have been sufficiently perplexing to warrant an early visit. Mac was just relieved that Nan had already left. "I'm in here, Willie, in the kitchen," Mac called out. A moment later, Willie poked his head around the hall corner and shook his head, looking at the mess that Mac had made. He leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms. "Well, I brought the Jeep and it's full of gas, but I'm not handing over the keys until you tell me what exactly is going on." Mac continued piling things into a couple of bags for the trip. He knew it was no use lying to his friend, and he needed the Jeep. "I'm going back to the shack, Willie." "Well, I figured that much out already. What I want to know is why you even want to go back there, especially at this time of year. I don't know if my old Jeep will even keep us on the roads up there. But just in case, I'll put some chains in the back if we need 'em." Without looking at him, Mac walked to the office, pried the lid off the small tin box and took out the note. Coming back into the kitchen, he handed it to Willie. His friend unfolded the paper and read silently. "Geez, what kind of a loony kook would write you something like that? And who is this Papa?" "Well, you know, Papa, Nan's favourite name for God." Mac shrugged, not sure what else to say. He took back the note and slid it into his shirt pocket. "Wait, you aren't thinking this is really from God, are you?" Mac stopped and turned to face him. He had just about finished packing anyway. "Willie, I'm not sure what to think about this. I mean, at first I thought it was just a hoax and it made me angry and sick to my stomach. Maybe I'm just losing it. I know it sounds crazy, but somehow I feel strangely drawn to find out for sure. I gotta go, Willie, or it'll drive me nuts forever." "Have you thought about the possibility that this might be the killer? What if he's luring you back for some reason?" "Of course I've thought of that. Part of me won't be disappointed if it is. I have a score to settle with him," he said grimly and paused. "But that doesn't make a lot of sense either. I'm not thinking the killer would sign this note Papa. You'd have to really know our family to come up with that." Willie was perplexed. Matt continued, "And no one who knows us that well would ever send a note like this. I'm thinking only God would, maybe. But God doesn't do stuff like that. At least, I've never heard of him sending someone a note. Not that he couldn't, but you know what I mean. And why would he want you to return to the shack anyway? I can't think of a worse place." The silence that hung between them grew awkward. Mac leaned back against the counter and stared a hole through the floor before speaking. "I'm not sure, Willie. I guess part of me would like to believe that God would care enough about me to send a note. I'm so confused, even after all this time. I just don't know what to think, and it isn't getting better. I feel like we're losing Kate, and that's killing me. Maybe what happened to Missy is God's judgment for what I did to my own dad. I just don't know." He looked up into the face of a man who cared more about him than anyone he knew, except Nan. "All I know is that I need to go back." There was silence between them before Willie spoke again. "So, when do we leave?" Mac was touched by his friend's willingness to jump into his insanity. "Thanks, buddy, but I really need to do this alone." "I thought you'd say that," Willie responded as he turned and walked out of the room. He returned a few moments later with a pistol and a box of shells in his hands. He gently laid them on the counter. "I figured I wouldn't be able to talk you out of going, so I thought you might need this. I believe you know how to use it." Mac looked at the gun. He knew Willie meant well and was trying to help. "Willie, I can't. It's been 30 years since I last touched a gun, and I don't intend to now. If I learned anything back then, it's that using violence to solve a problem always landed me in a worse problem. But what if it is Missy's killer? What if he's waiting for you up there? What are you going to do then? He shrugged. I honestly don't know, Willie. I'll take my chances, I guess. But you'll be defenceless. There's no telling what he has in mind or in hand. Just take it, Mac. Willie slid the pistol and shells across the counter towards him. You don't have to use it. Mac looked down at the gun, and after some deliberation reached slowly for it and the shells, putting them carefully in his pocket. Okay, just in case. He then turned to pick up some of his equipment and, arms loaded, headed out towards the jeep. Willie grabbed the large duffel bag remaining, finding it heavier than he expected, and grunted as he hoisted it. Geez, Mac, if you think God is going to be up there, why all these supplies? Mac smiled rather sadly. I just thought I'd cover my bases, be prepared for whatever happens, or doesn't. They made their way out of the house to the driveway where the jeep sat. Willie pulled the keys out of his pocket and handed them to Mac. So, Willie broke the silence, where is everybody? And what did Nan think of you heading out for the shack? I can't imagine she was real pleased. Nan and the kids are visiting her sister up in the islands, and I didn't tell her, Mac confessed. Willie was obviously surprised. What? You never keep secrets from her. I can't believe you lied to her. I didn't lie to her, Mac objected. Well, excuse me for splitting hairs, Willie snapped back. OK, you didn't lie to her because you didn't tell her the whole truth. Oh yeah, she's going to understand that all right. He rolled his eyes. Mac ignored the outburst and walked back to the house and into his office. There he found the spare set of keys for his car and home and, hesitating for just a moment, picked up the small tin box. He then headed back out towards Willie. So, what do you think he looks like? Chuckled Willie as he approached. Who? Asked Mac. God, of course. What do you think he'll look like, if he even bothers to show up, I mean? Boy, I can just see you scaring the living daylights out of some poor hiker, asking him if he's God and then demanding answers and all. Mac grinned at the thought. I don't know. Maybe he's a really bright light or a burning bush. I've always sort of pictured him as a really big grandpa, with a long white flowing beard, sort of like Gandalf in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. He shrugged and handed Willie his keys, and they exchanged a brief hug. Willie climbed into Mac's car and rolled down the window. Well, if he does show, say hi for me, Willie said, with a smile. Tell him I have a few questions of my own. And Mac, try not to piss him off. They both laughed. Seriously, I am concerned for you, buddy. I wish I was going with you. Or Nan or someone. I hope you find everything you need up there. I will be saying a prayer for you. Thanks, Willie. I love you too. He waved as Willie backed out of the driveway. Mac knew that his friend would keep his word. He could probably use all the praise he could get. He watched until Willie was round the corner and out of sight, then slipped the note from his shirt pocket, read it one more time, and then placed it into the little tin box, which he deposited on the passenger seat amongst some of the other gear. Locking the doors, he headed back into the house, and a sleepless night. Well before dawn on Friday, Mac was already out of town and heading down the interstate. Nan had called the night before from her sisters to let him know that they had made it safe and sound, and he didn't expect to get another call until at least Sunday. By that time he would probably be on his way back, if he wasn't home already. He forwarded the house phone to his cell, just in case. Not that he would have any reception once he was in the reserve. He retraced the same path they had taken 3.5 years before, with a few minor changes, not as many loo breaks, and he sailed by Multnomah Falls without looking. He had pushed away any thoughts of the place since Missy's disappearance, sequestering his emotions securely in the padlocked basement of his own heart. On the long stretch up the gorge, Mac felt a creeping panic begin to penetrate his consciousness. He had tried to avoid thinking about what he was doing and just keep putting one foot in front of the other. bit like grass pushing through concrete. The repressed feelings and fears somehow began to poke through. His eyes darkened and his hands tightened on the steering wheel as he fought the temptation at every off-ramp to turn around and go home. He knew he was driving straight into the centre of his pain, the vortex of the great sadness that had so diminished his sense of being alive. Flashes of visual memory and stabbing instants of blistering fury now came in waves, attended by the taste of bile and blood in his mouth. He finally reached Le Grand, where he gassed up, and then took Highway 82 out to Joseph. He was half tempted to stop and look in on Tommy, but decided against it. The fewer people who thought he was a raving lunatic, the better. Instead, he topped up his tank and headed out. Traffic was light, and the smaller roads were remarkably clear and dry for this time of year, much warmer than he had expected. But it seemed that the further he drove, the slower he travelled, as if the shack were somehow repelling his approach. The jeep crossed the snow line as he climbed the last couple of miles to the trail that would take him down to the shack. Above the whine of the engine, he could hear the tyres crunch doggedly through the deepening snow and ice. Even after a couple of wrong turns and some backtracking, it was only early afternoon when Mac finally pulled over and parked at the barely visible trailhead. He sat there for almost 5 minutes, reprimanding himself for being such a fool. With every mile that he had travelled from Joseph, the memories had come back with adrenaline clarity, and now he was mentally certain that he wanted to go no further. But the inner compulsion to press on was irresistible. Even as he argued with himself, he buttoned up his coat and reached for his leather gloves. He stood and stared down the path, deciding to leave everything in the car and hike the mile or so down to the lake. At least that way he wouldn't have to lug anything back up the hill when he returned to leave, which he now expected would be very soon. It was cold enough that his breath hung in the air around him, and it even felt like it might snow. The pain that had been building in his stomach finally pushed him into panic. After only 5 steps, he stopped and retched so strongly that it brought him to his knees. "Please help me," he groaned. He stood up on shaky legs and took another step away from the car. Then he stopped and turned back. He opened the passenger door and reached in, rummaging around until he felt the small tin box. He prized the lid off and found what he was looking for, his favourite picture of Missy, which he removed along with the note. Replacing the lid, he left the box on the seat. He paused for a moment, looking at the glove box. Finally, he opened it and grabbed Willie's gun, checking to make sure it was loaded and the safety catch was on. Standing up, he closed the door, reached under his coat, and stuck the gun in the belt in the small of his back. He turned and faced the path once more, taking one last look at Missy's picture before sliding it into his shirt pocket alongside the note. If they found him dead, at least they would know who had been on his mind. The trail was treacherous, the rocks icy and slippery. Every step took concentration as he descended into the thickening forest. It was eerily quiet. The only sounds he could hear were the crunch of his steps on the snow and the heaviness of his breathing. Max started feeling like he was being watched, and once he even spun around quickly to see if anyone was there. As much as he wanted to turn and run back to the jeep, his feet seemed to have a will of their own, determined to continue down the path and deeper into the dimly lit and increasingly dense woods. Suddenly, something moved close by. Startled, he froze, silent and alert. With his heart pounding in his ears and his mouth suddenly dry, he slowly reached behind his back, sliding the pistol from his belt. Snapping off the safety, he peered intensely into the dark underbrush, trying to see or hear anything that might explain the noise and slow the rush of adrenaline. But whatever moved had now stopped. Was it waiting for him? Just in case, he stood motionless for a few minutes before he again began inching his way further down the trail, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest seemed to close in around him, and he began to seriously wonder if he had taken the wrong path. Out of the corner of his eye, peering between the low branches of a nearby tree, He saw movement again and instantly crouched down. Something ghostly like a shadow slipped into the brush. Or had he only imagined it? Again he waited, not shifting a muscle. Was that God? He doubted it. Maybe an animal. He couldn't remember if there were wolves up here, and deer or elk would make more noise. And then the thought he had been avoiding. What if it was worse? What if he had been lured up here? But for what? Slowly rising from his hiding place, gun still drawn, he took a step forward, when suddenly the bush behind him seemed to explode. Mac whipped around, scared and ready to fight for his life, but before he could squeeze the trigger, he recognised the rear end of a badger scampering back up the trail. He slowly exhaled the breath he hadn't realised he had been holding, lowered his gun, and shook his head. Mac the Courageous had been reduced to just another scared boy in the woods. Snapping the safety back on, he tucked the gun away. Someone could get hurt, he thought with a sigh of relief. Taking another deep breath and exhaling slowly, he calmed himself. Determined that he was done being afraid, he continued down the path, trying to look more confident than he felt. He hoped he hadn't come all this way for nothing. If God was really meeting him here, he was more than ready to get a few things off his chest. Respectfully, of course. A few turns later, he stumbled out of the woods and into a clearing. At the far side and down the slope, he saw it again. The shack. He stood, staring at it, his stomach a ball of motion and turmoil. On the surface it seemed that nothing had changed other than the winter stripping of the deciduous trees and the white shroud of snow that blanketed the surroundings. The shack itself looked dead and empty, but as he stared, it seemed for a moment to transform into an evil face, twisted in some demonic grimace. Excuse me, sorry. Twisted in some demonic grimace, looking straight back at him and daring him to approach. Ignoring the rising panic he was feeling, Mac walked with resolve down the last 100 yards and up onto the porch. The memories and horror of the last time he stood at this door came flooding back, and he hesitated before pushing it open. "Hello?" he called, not too loudly. Clearing his throat, he called again, this time louder. "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice echoed off the emptiness inside. Feeling bolder, he stepped completely across the threshold and stopped. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he began to make out the details of the room by the afternoon light filtering in through the broken windows. Stepping into the main room, he recognised the old chairs and table. Mac couldn't help himself as his eyes were drawn to the one place he could not bear to look. Even after a few years, the faded bloodstain was still clearly visible in the wood near the fireplace, where they had found Missy's dress. "I'm so sorry, honey." Tears began to well up in his eyes. And finally, his heart exploded like a flash flood, releasing his pent-up anger and letting it rush down the rocky canyon of his emotions. Turning his eyes heavenward, he began screaming his anguished questions. "Why? Why did you let this happen? Why did you bring me here? Of all the places to meet you, why here? Wasn't it enough to kill my baby? Do you have to toy with me too?" In a blind rage, Matt grabbed the nearest chair and flung it at the window. It smashed into pieces. He picked up one of the legs and began destroying everything he could. Groans and moans of despair and fury spat through his lips as he beat his wrath into this terrible place. "I hate you!" In a frenzy, he pounded out his rage until he was exhausted and spent. Despairing and defeated, Mac slumped to the floor next to the bloodstain. He touched it carefully. This was all that was left of his Missy. As he lay next to her, his fingers tenderly traced the discoloured edges, and softly he whispered, "Missy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I couldn't find you." Even in his exhaustion, the anger seethed, and he once again took aim at the indifferent God he imagined somewhere beyond the roof of the shack. God, you couldn't even let us find her and bury her properly. Was that just too much to ask? As the mix of emotions ebbed and flowed, his anger giving way to pain, a fresh wave of sorrow began to mix with his confusion. So, where are you? I thought you wanted to meet me here. Well, I'm here, God. And you? You're nowhere to be found. You've never been around when I've needed you. Not when I was a little boy. Not when I lost Missy. Not now. Some papa you are. He spat out the words. Mac sat there in silence, the emptiness of the place invading his soul. His jumble of unanswered questions and far-flung accusations settled to the floor with him, and then slowly drained into a pit of desolation. The great sadness tightened around him, and he almost welcomed the smothering sensation. This pain he knew. He was familiar with it, almost like a friend. Mac could feel the gun in the small of his back, an inviting cold pressed against his skin. He pulled it out, not sure what he was going to do. Oh, to stop caring, to stop feeling the pain, to never feel anything again. Suicide? At the moment that option was almost attractive. It would be so easy, he thought. No more tears, no more pain. He could almost see a black chasm opening in the floor behind the gun he was staring at, a darkness sucking any last vestiges of hope from his heart. Killing himself would be one way to strike back at God, if God even existed. Clouds parted outside and a sunbeam suddenly spilled into the room, piercing the centre of his despair. But what about Nan? And what about Josh or Kate or Tyler and John? As much as he longed to stop the ache in his heart, he knew he could not add to their hurt. Mac sat in his emotionally spent stupor, weighing the options in the feel of the gun. A cold breeze brushed past his face, and part of him just wanted to lie down and freeze to death. He was so exhausted. He slumped back against the wall and rubbed his weary eyes. He let them fall closed as he mumbled, "I love you, Missy. I miss you so much." Soon he drifted without effort into dead sleep. It was probably only minutes later that Mac woke with a jerk. Surprised that he nodded off, he stood up quickly. Stuffing the gun back into his waistband and his anger back into the deepest part of his soul, he started for the door. This is ridiculous. I'm such an idiot. To think that I hoped God might actually care enough to send me a note. He looked up into the open rafters. I'm done, God. I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying to find you in all of this. And with that, he walked out the door. Mac determined that this was the last time he would go looking for God. If God wanted him, God would have to come find him. He reached into his pocket and took out the note he had found in his mailbox and tore it into little pieces, letting it slowly sift through his fingers, to be carried off by the cold wind that kicked up. A weary old man, he stepped off the porch and with heavy footsteps and a heavier heart started the hike back to the car. He had barely walked 50 feet up the trail when he felt a sudden rush of warm air overtake him from behind. The chirping of a songbird broke the icy silence. The path in front of him rapidly lost its veneer of snow and ice, as if someone were blow-drying it. Mac stopped and watched, as all around him the white covering dissolved and was replaced by emerging and radiant growth. 3 weeks of spring unfurled before him in 30 seconds. He rubbed his eyes and steadied himself in the swirl of activity. Even the light snow that had begun to fall had changed to tiny blossoms, lazily drifting to the ground. What he was seeing, of course, was not possible. The snowbanks had vanished, and summer wildflowers began to colour the borders of the trail and into the forest as far as he could see. Robins and finches darted after one another among the trees. Squirrels and chipmunks occasionally crossed the path ahead, some stopping to sit up and watch him for a moment before plunging back into the undergrowth. He even thought that he glimpsed a young buck emerging out of a dark glade in the forest, but on second look it was gone. As if that weren't enough, the scent of blooms began to fill the air, not just the drifting aroma of wild mountain flowers, but the richness of roses and orchids and other exotic fragrances found in more tropical climes. Mac was no longer thinking about home. A terror gripped him, as if he had opened Pandora's box and was being swept away into the centre of madness, to be lost forever. Unsteady, he carefully turned around, trying to hold on to some sense of sanity. He was stunned. Little, if anything, was the same. The dilapidated shack had been replaced by a sturdy and beautifully constructed log cabin, now standing directly between him and the lake, which he could see just above the rooftop. It was built out of hand-peeled, full-length logs, every one scribed for a perfect fit. Instead of the dark and forbidding overgrowth of brush, briars and devil's club, everything that Mac could see was now postcard perfect. Smoke was lazily wending its way from the chimney into the late afternoon sky, a sign of activity inside. A walkway had been built to and around the front porch, bordered by a small white picket fence. The sound of laughter was coming from nearby, maybe inside, but he wasn't sure. Perhaps this is what it was like to experience a complete psychotic break. "I'm losing it," Mac whispered to himself. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." It was a place that Mac could only have imagined in his best dreams, and this made it all the more suspect. The sights were wondrous, the scents intoxicating, and his feet, as if they had a mind of their own, took him back down the walkway and up onto the front porch. Flowers bloomed everywhere, and the mix of floral fragrances and pungent herbs aroused hints of memories long forgotten. He had always heard that the nose was the best link to the past, that the olfactory sense was the strongest for tapping into forgotten history, and now some long-stored remembrances of his own childhood flitted through his mind. Once on the porch, he stopped again. Voices were clearly coming from inside. Mac rejected the sudden impulse to run away, as if he were some kid who had thrown his ball into a neighbour's flower garden. But if God is inside, it wouldn't do much good anyway, would it? He closed his eyes and shook his head to see if he could erase the hallucination and restore reality. But when he opened them, it was all still there. He tentatively reached out and touched the wood railing. It certainly seemed real. He now faced another dilemma. What should you do when you come to the door of a house, or cabin in this case, where God might be? Should you knock? Presumably God already knew that Mac was there. Maybe he ought to simply walk in and introduce himself, but that seemed equally absurd. And how should he address him? Should he call him Father or Almighty One, or perhaps Mr. God? And would it be best if he fell down and worshipped? Not that he was really in the mood. As he tried to establish some inner mental balance, the anger that he thought had so recently died inside him began to emerge. No longer concerned or caring about what to call God, and energised by his anger, he walked up to the door. Mac decided to bang loudly and see what happened, but just as he raised his fist to do so, the door flew open, and he was looking directly into the face of a large, beaming African-American woman. Instinctively he jumped back, but he was too slow. With speed that belied her size, she crossed the distance between them and engulfed him in her arms, lifting him clear off his feet and spinning him around like a little child. And all the while she was shouting his name, "Mackenzie Allen Phillips!" with the ardour of someone seeing a long-lost and deeply loved relative. She finally put him back on earth, and with her hands on his shoulders, pushed him back as if to get a good look at him. "Mac, look at you!" she fairly exploded. "Here you are, and so grown up. I've been really looking forward to seeing you face to face. It is so wonderful to have you here with us. My, how I do love you." And with that she wrapped herself around him again. Mac was speechless. In a few seconds this woman had breached pretty much every social propriety behind which he had so safely entrenched himself. But something in the way she looked at him and yelled his name made him equally delighted to see her too, even though he didn't have a clue who she was. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed by the scent emanating from her, and it shook him. It was the smell of flowers with overtones of gardenia and jasmine, unmistakably his mother's perfume that he kept hidden away in his little tin box. He had already been perched precariously on the precipice of emotion, and now the flooding scent and attendant memories staggered him. He could feel the warmth of tears beginning to gather behind his eyes, as if they were knocking on the door of his heart. It seemed that she saw them too. "It's okay, honey. You can let it all out. I know you've been hurt, and I know you're angry and confused. So go ahead and let it out. It does a soul good to let the waters run once in a while, the healing waters." But while Mac could not stop the tears from filling his eyes, he was not ready to let go. Not yet, not with this woman. With every effort he could muster, he kept himself from falling back into the black hole of his emotions. Meanwhile, this woman stood there with her arms outstretched, as if they were the very arms of his mother. He felt the presence of love. It was warm, inviting, melting. "Not ready?" she responded. "That's okay, we'll do things on your terms and time. Well, come on in. Can I take your coat? And that gun? You don't really need that, do you? We wouldn't want anyone to get hurt, would we?" Mac wasn't sure what to do or say. Who was she? And how did she know? He was rooted to the spot where he stood, but slowly and mechanically he took off his coat. The large black woman gathered his coat and he handed her the gun, which she took from him with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. Just as she turned to enter the cabin, a small, distinctively Asian woman emerged from behind her. "Here, let me take those," her voice sang. Obviously she had not meant the coat or gun, but something else, and she was in front of him in the blink of an eye. He stiffened as he felt something sweep gently across his cheek. Without moving, he looked down and could see that she was busy with a fragile crystal bottle and a small brush, like those he had seen Nan and Kate use for makeup, gently removing something from his face. Before he could ask, she smiled and whispered, "Mackenzie, we all have things we value enough to collect, don't we?" His little tin box flashed through his mind. "I collect tears." As she stepped back, Mac found himself involuntarily squinting in her direction, as if doing so would allow his eyes to see her better. But strangely, he still had a difficult time focusing on her. She seemed almost to shimmer in the light, and her hair blew in all directions, even though there was hardly a breeze. It was almost easier to see her out of the corner of his eye than it was to look at her directly. He then glanced past her and noticed that a 3rd person had emerged from the cabin, this one a man. He appeared Middle Eastern and was dressed like a labourer, complete with tool belt and gloves. He stood easily, leaning against the door jamb with arms crossed in front of him, wearing jeans covered in wood dust and a plaid shirt with sleeves rolled just above the elbows, revealing well-muscled forearms. His features were pleasant enough, but he was not particularly handsome, not a man who would stick out in a crowd. But his eyes and smile lit up his face, and Mac found it difficult to look away. Mac stepped back again, feeling a bit overwhelmed. "Are there more of you?" he asked a little hoarsely. The 3 looked at one another and laughed. Mac couldn't help but smile. "No, Mackenzie," chuckled the black woman. "We is all that you get, and believe me, we're more than enough." Mac tried again to look at the Asian woman. From what he could tell, this wiry-looking person was maybe of northern Chinese or Nepalese or even Mongolian ethnicity. It was hard to tell because his eyes had to work to see her at all. From her clothing, Mac assumed she was a groundskeeper or gardener. She had gloves folded into her belt, not the heavy leather gloves of the man, but the lightweight cloth and rubber ones that Mac himself used for yard work at home. She was dressed in plain jeans, with ornamental designs at the fringes, knees covered in dirt from where she had been kneeling, and a brightly coloured blouse with splashes of yellow and red and blue. But he knew all this, as more an impression of her than from actually seeing her, as she seemed to phase in and out of his vision. The man then stepped in, touched Mac on the shoulder, gave him a kiss on both cheeks, and embraced him strongly. Mac knew instantly that he liked him. As they separated, the man stepped back, and the Asian lady moved towards him, again, this time taking his face in both her hands. Gradually and intentionally, she moved her face closer to his, and just when he imagined she was going to kiss him, she stopped and looked deep into his eyes. Mac thought he could almost see through her. Then she smiled, and her scents seemed to wrap themselves around him and lift a huge weight off his shoulders, as if he had been carting his gear in a backpack. Max suddenly felt lighter than air, almost as if he were no longer touching the ground. She was hugging him without hugging him, or really without even touching him. Only when she pulled back, which was probably just seconds later, did he realise that he was still standing on his feet and that his feet were still touching the decking. "Oh, don't mind her," the big black woman laughed. "She has that effect on everyone." "I like it," he muttered, and all three burst into more laughter, and now Mac found himself laughing along with them, not knowing exactly why, but not caring either. When they finally stopped giggling, the large woman put her arm around Mac's shoulders, drew him to her and said, "Okay, we know who you are, but we should probably introduce ourselves to you. I," she waved her hands with a flourish, "am the housekeeper and cook. You may call me Eloisia." "Elucia." "Elucia." "Elucia?" asked Mac, not comprehending at all. "OK, you don't have to call me Elucia. It is just a name I'm rather fond of and has a particular meaning to me, so—" She crossed her arms and put one hand under her chin as if thinking especially hard. "You could call me what Nan does." "What? You don't mean—" Now Mac was surprised and even more confused. Surely this was not the Papa who sent the note. "I mean, are you saying Papa?" "Yes," she responded and smiled, waiting for him to speak as if he were about to say something, which he was not at all. "And I," interrupted the man, who looked to be about in his 30s and stood a little shorter than Mac himself, "I try to keep things fixed up around here. I enjoy working with my hands, although, as these two will tell you, I take pleasure in cooking and gardening as much as they do." "You look as if you're from the Middle East, maybe Arab?" Mac guessed. "Actually, I'm a stepbrother of that great family. I'm Hebrew, to be exact, from the house of Judah." "Then," Mac was suddenly staggered by his own realisation, "then you are—" "Jesus, yes. And you may call me that if you like. After all, it has become my common name. My mother called me Yeshua, but I have also been known to respond to Joshua or even Jesse." Mac stood dumbfounded and mute. What he was looking at and listening to simply would not compute. It was all so impossible. But here he was, or was he really here at all? Suddenly he felt faint. Emotion swept over him as his mind attempted desperately to catch up with all the information. Just as he was about to crumple to his knees, the Asian woman stepped closer and deflected his attention. "And I am Sarayu," she said as she tilted her head in a slight bow and smiled. "Keeper of the gardens, among other things." Thoughts tumbled over each other as Mac struggled to figure out what to do. Was one of these people God? What if they were his hallucinations or angels? Or God was coming later? That could be embarrassing. Since there were three of them, maybe this was a trinity sort of thing. But 2 women and a man, and none of them white? Then again, why had he naturally assumed that God would be white? He knew his mind was rambling, so he focused on the one question he most wanted answered. "Then, which one of you is God?" "I am," said all three in unison. Mac looked from one to the next, and even though he couldn't begin to grasp what he was seeing and hearing, somehow he believed them. That's all for today, folks. join me next time, or do feel free to go back and catch up later.